Liz Truss's obsession with tax cuts for the rich and pay rises for the wealthy might seem at odds with the fact that we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But Truss is clear. She'll give bungs to elites even if it makes her unpopular with the public.
Lots of families at the moment are really struggling, and they'll see that one of the things you're happy to see happen is for bankers to get bigger bonuses. Whose side are you on?
What I want to see is a growing economy, so everybody in our country has the high-paid jobs that they deserve, that the investment into their town, the new businesses being set up. That's the kind of Britain that I want to see.
And if that means the rich get richer, that's fine.
If that means taking difficult decisions, which are going to help Britain become more competitive, help Britain become more attractive, help more investment flow into our country, yes, I'm absolutely prepared to take those decisions.
So you're willing to do unpopular things if you think it can contribute to a bigger economy?
That's right. And I will always work to make sure that we are helping those who are struggling. That's why we took the action that we took on energy bills, because we didn't want to see households facing unaffordable bills.
There are so many things to say about that. I mean, obviously, the factual part of it, completely untrue. We know that if you cut taxes on the rich, that doesn't bring about higher levels of growth. And we know that because it's been tried. It's been tried for decades, especially since 2010. We had massive cuts to corporation tax. And what did we have? Completely stagnant growth. We've got wages which now are still lower than they were in 2008. So the idea that cutting taxes on the rich will help with growth, will help anyone other than the rich, is nonsense. The other reason I think that's a ridiculous thing that she said there, well, not ridiculous, you can see why she's saying it, but a completely implausible thing she said, is she's trying to make this argument. Look, I might be doing things which are unpopular, but I'm not driven by pleasing people. I'm not here to please people. I'm here to make policy that works. Now, you've got to remember here, when did she promise the tax cuts, right? She promised the tax cuts in a Tory leadership election because that electorate wanted them. I don't think she did have big ideological plans for the economy. I think she promised whatever she needed to promise in that election to get elected. It just so happened that the electorate were a very unrepresentative group of right-wingers who love tax cuts. And now she's got to explain to the public who don't really like tax cuts on the rich why she now has that policy. Now she's saying, I don't care if it's unpopular, I'm going to do it because it's right. You didn't do it because it's right. You did it because you thought that that would help you win in a Tory leadership election. And now you're coming up with these really bizarre excuses to explain to the public why you are sticking to them. On the theme of Truss not caring what the public think, Beth Rigby from Sky honed in on another of Truss's unpopular opinions.
They might not think it's fair that their children have to fund government debt to fund, say, tax cuts for big business or energy bills, and then they ultimately pick up the bill all their children do, all their children's children. They'll think it's not fair. You understand that. You can disagree with that, but you understand that point.
That's a particular point of view you're expressing, which is what people on the left of politics often express. What I'm saying is that by keeping taxes low and growing the economy, we will get more tax revenues in. And actually, that will succeed in the long term in bringing the opportunities that people want to see. That's what I'm saying.
68% of the public think there should be a windfall tax. So it's not necessarily the left, it's a large proportion of voters that like a policy that you're not backing, just to point that out to you.
Dahlia, I want to bring you in on this. I thought that was quite strong from Beth Rigby. I thought it was pretty cheeky of Liz Truss to say, oh, that question you're asking about a windfall tax, you're just being an ideological left-winger. And I mean, I don't think Beth Rigby is particularly ideologically left-wing, but she has a good response, which is no, 68% of the public think we should be putting a windfall tax on the super profits of the energy giants. This isn't an ideological thing. What did you make of that exchange?
I think of Liz Truss as like the grim reaper of the British economy, where you have, the British economy, it's been like sick for a while. It's been kind of rotting from the inside. And now Liz Truss has arrived to kind of usher it over the threshold into sort of complete bleakness. But what I find, firstly, I mean, I do think that was a strong sort of pushback from Beth Rigby. But when you watch the full clip, there is this really frustrating tenor where Beth Rigby talks about, this is going to be really unpopular. This is going to be really unpopular, which is, it's good, to show that this kind of politics is not shared by the British public. But also, at no point does Beth Rigby actually make the economic point that trickle down economics doesn't work. And I think that that's really important, because it's really important to not buy into this idea that Liz Truss is promoting, which is that, this is a difficult decision, but it's going to work. It's going to work in the long term, even if it's going to be difficult in the short term. No, as you said before, we have tried trickle down economics for about 30 to 40 years now. It hasn't worked. All it's done is what it's always been designed to do, which is to funnel all the wealth from the workers who create that wealth to the very top. And what I find as well, so deeply shameful about the way that Liz Truss frames it, and I would argue the way that Beth Rigby kind of allows her to frame it in that way, is her framing this as taking difficult decisions. I find that so enraging, because using working class people who didn't elect you, and therefore you're not actually answerable to, at least for the next few years, using those people as essentially human shields to protect the profits of, your fellow members of the establishment, of your classmates. That's not a difficult decision. That's actually a very easy decision, and a decision that you're not going to be held accountable for, at least in the foreseeable future. A difficult decision are things like figuring out how to make 30 quid last for a weekly shop, or, figuring out how to get around your town without a car when you don't have decent public transport infrastructure, or figuring out, what am I going to pick tonight, a cold shower or a cold home? Those are difficult decisions. And those are decisions that people like Liz Truss and the execs that she's protecting are never going to have to make. But many of us are going to have to make throughout the winter. And for me, I honestly, in times like this, I ask the same question that I find myself always asking when it comes to the myriad of Tory prime ministers that we've had over the past decade. And that's another thing. You can't really talk about long-term wins for the economy when your party has been in power for the past 10 years and things have only gotten worse. But one question that I always ask, and it's somewhat flippant, but I just would love to know, is this coming from plain stupidity or just pure evil? Does Liz Truss genuinely believe that at this moment, when in some parts of the country, mainly, London and the Northeast, nearly 40% of children are in poverty, does she really genuinely believe that at this moment, the best thing for the public is to cut taxes for the ultra wealthy? Does she actually believe that giving rich people more money in this moment is going to make everyone wealthier, despite the fact that this has been thoroughly discredited, not just theoretically, but obviously more importantly in practice? Or is this just a matter of Truss believing that the British people are currently in a moment of weakness, they're in a moment of fatigue, after several years of a stagnant economy, after COVID, etc. And the energy crisis is simply providing a useful cover story to implement measures that have always been at the heart of conservative ideology, which is trying to squeeze as much wealth as possible out of working people, funneling up and hoarding it for a tiny few. I would just love to know which probably some combination of the two. And it doesn't really matter, because the outcome is the same and the response has to be the same. But I do kind of wonder to what extent this is, purely air between her ears, or whether it's, just cynicism.
Yeah, I suppose I kind of think it's maybe a third way, probably unpopular with our audience. It's evil in the sense that she doesn't care. I don't think she is necessarily coming up with this policy because she actively wants to make poor people more miserable. I think what it is she took whatever position she thought would help her become leader of the Conservative Party, just like she was pro-Remain, then she was pro-Brexit when she realised that would help her in the Conservative Party. Loads of examples of her sort of flip-flopping throughout her career. I think basically she has been thinking for a long time now, how do I become leader of the Tory Party? She decided, I have to promise tax cuts. That's what she's done. That doesn't excuse it, because what has to come alongside that is she doesn't care if it makes people miserable. I don't know. I think she probably doesn't actively want to make people miserable, but she really doesn't care if she does. I think it's probably a very deep lack of compassion So her own personal advancement is way more important than millions of people struggling to feed their kids. Now, this opposition to trickle down, you might expect to hear this on Novara Media. Radical leftists, of course, they hate trickle down economics. Well, that opposition is not just limited to us. On the same day Truss gave that interview, Joe Biden tweeted this: "I am sick and tired of trickle down economics. It has never worked. We're building an economy from the bottom up and middle out." Now, that couldn't sound further from the speech given by Liz Truss. And this is quite different to the last time a British Prime Minister was doing trickle-down economics. This all really emerges from that Reaganite, Thatcherite era. At that time, obviously, you had Thatcher and Reagan at the same time in office. They were both very much pursuing the same neoliberal policies, both saying what we need to do is cut taxes, raise interest rates. We don't have to care about inequality because what we're doing is going for growth. Obviously, as we've said, it didn't work. The wealth never trickled down. But you did have these two major economies in lockstep, obviously one of them more major than the other. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. Dahlia, does this pose any risks for Liz Truss that, at least when it comes to the special relationship, if we're going to, I suppose, indulge that concept between the United States and the UK, that we're radically diverging, at least rhetorically?
I don't think the US particularly gives a crap about what the British Prime Minister has to say, particularly since that kind of global standing has fallen now that we've left the EU. But I think that that is a really interesting position, coming from Joe Biden. And I think that is a shift. And that is because, Joe Biden within the Democratic Party, especially, is not by any means on the left of the Democratic Party. I would argue that he's not even in the center of the Democratic Party, but he's actually on the right. And that, his politics are probably what a Republican politics would have been indistinguishable from a Republican 10, 15, 20 years ago. At the end of the day, what we're seeing here is hopefully a recognition that trickle-down economics is fundamentally about believing that poor people either don't know how to or don't deserve to have control over their fair share of wealth that they create in the economy. So instead of distributing that wealth fairly, because at the end of the day, the key logic underpinning trickle-down economics is this idea that poor people are not smart enough to spend their money wisely. So what we need to do is we need to hoard all that wealth and give it to the rich because they will spend it in a way that is good for the economy. They'll invest in creating jobs, they'll create businesses, they'll increase wages, etc. So that's where we should put the money rather than putting it towards, back to the public through good wages, through a collective welfare system, through public ownership. We've been talking a lot about, the divine right of kings to rule and how supposedly far along from that we've come. But really, trickle-down economics is about the divine right of the already very rich to rule. And that's the kind of heart of that logic. But obviously, anyone who's been like a sentient being for the past 30 years knows that is nonsense. Under a growth-driven and capitalist society, when working class people have access to wealth and infrastructure that they are entitled to, they spend it in the economy and they drive growth within the economy. That's what creates jobs. That's what creates wages. What doesn't create jobs and create, higher wages is rich people accumulating that wealth, putting it in offshore assets, putting it in offshore bank accounts, and maybe spending it on, a few gas-guzzling luxury assets like private planes that are going to accelerate the decline of our planet. Now, I don't believe that we should organize our economy around a growth principle. I think it's devastating for the environment, devastating for the climate, and I don't think it makes us happy or satisfied as human beings. But let's play along that logic for a while, the logic of a Liz Truss, which is, wanting to sustain a growth-driven economy. Even within that, it is a complete fallacy to believe that tax cuts are going to drive that. And so the fact that even Joe Biden can now see that that story that has been told around trickle-down economics, that ultimately this is something that's going to benefit the rest of society, rather than just being a way of funneling resources to the top, who we believe are mentally and intellectually superior to the rest of us. If Joe Biden can realize that, hardly a socialist, then there is then this is what I mean by, is it stupidity or is it evil? And I think it's a combination of the both. It's wanting to do the thing that you've always been wanting to do, which is redirect wealth away from those who deserve it and who are entitled to it and who created it, towards those who largely didn't create that wealth, but just being a little bit behind the times when it comes to the story. Like the trickle-down economic story, it's kind of old, Liz. You need to like update it a little bit, because now that you've been doing it for 30 years, we've realized that, you know, most people hear that and think, well, that's what I've been told for the past 30 years. And it turned out that what they called trickle-down economics was just the rich pissing at us from above. So, yeah, I think that it is a really interesting shift in Joe Biden's politics. I wonder if it actually represents a genuine shift in the economic policy that is going to undermine that administration. That is yet to be seen. But it also just shows kind of how tired and unimaginative and how much we are really at the dregs of conservative politicians. They are still peddling a very outdated, unconvincing, and generally unpopular economic story that was always false, but now whose falsehood is kind of more widely known by the public.